Welcome back to our HYPR-7 video series where we've been running through everything you need to know about our new hybrid ballistic rifle scope. In the previous video, we discussed the difference between normal analog optical rifle scopes and digital rifle scopes and the strengths and weaknesses of each. And we spoke about how we've been able to integrate the very best of these two different ways of thinking into the HYPR-7. We also then looked at a basic orientation of the scope, the different external knobs and buttons and what they do, and helped you to understand where everything is before we jump in the deep end. Today we're going to get down to business and take some time to look at initial setup. What do you need to do when you first take one of these units out the box? We're going to start with battery installation. Now we've decided to use a AAA battery for the HYPR-7 purely because they are cheap and they can be found pretty much anywhere in the world. If you're busy driving out to a hunt in a rural area and you realize that you've forgotten to bring spare batteries, it's not the end of the world, because there's a good chance that any random convenience store in the middle of nowhere that you drive past is going to be stocking AAAs. Now the battery is not included purely because most shipping companies don't allow it, but once you've picked up a AAA, you're going to install it by removing the battery cap on top of the battery compartment and fitting the battery in with the positive side facing downwards. In other words, you want the flat side facing up top. This is really important. It won't work if you put it the other way. The battery should give you days of continuous use or weeks of normal use and will last almost indefinitely if the unit is switched off. You can set the auto shut-off timer using the Element Ballistics app. When you connect your scope, you'll see options for switch off if inactive for 1 minute, 5 minutes, 50 and 30, and never. You can basically decide where you want that to sit. And don't worry if your battery's starting to get low that it might just down you suddenly without any warning. When the battery gets really low, the device will go into emergency mode, which basically still allows you to use the scope for a few hours. It just goes into a low power mode where it's displaying the reticle. You can still take your shot, but certain ballistic functions or weather measuring functions are impaired. So yeah, don't worry about it dying on you. It's not going to happen. With your battery installed, you should be able to hold in the power button and the display should turn on. Don't worry if the display is not perfectly in focus or if it's not displaying in the right units. We're going to get to that a little bit later. Next, you're going to want to mount your scope. Now, you don't need to buy external mounts for this. The HYPR-7 comes with a uni mount that's very, very secure, and we include two bases. The one that comes on the scope is a little bit longer. It's got 3 cross bolts and allows you to actually cantilever your scope slightly back off your rail if you've got a really long length of pull. The shorter one is just as strong, just as rigid, but it's slightly lighter. So you've got 2 options and either of them will work. The nuts on the side are universal, metric or imperial nuts. You can use a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter socket and torque these down to a maximum of 50 inch-pounds. Make sure your eye relief and length of pull is correct before torquing the base down, because the actual ring mount where it sits on the scope doesn't have much room to actually slide the scope forward and backwards like you would have with a more traditional rifle scope. All that forward and backward adjustment has to be done with the mount itself. From here you can shoulder your rifle, get comfortable behind it, and then begin to adjust the diopter at the back here until the reticle becomes clearly focused to your eye. You can also decide whether you want to install the rubber eye cup and rubber lens cap in the front. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be leaving it off. The mount is tilt adjustable and marked with plus and minus 80 MOA of tilt. This will become useful when it comes to zeroing your rifle, because you can actually use this base to optically center the display. This will prevent your reticle from shifting too far towards the very edge of your display. This can particularly be an issue if you're zeroing really far or really, really close. So a lot of air rifles experience this if you're zeroing at like 20 to 30 yards. Your line of sight actually has to tilt at quite an extreme angle to meet your trajectory line, and that's where a lot of these issues come in. But don't worry about that now, we'll get to that a bit later. The HYPR-7 does have 4 generic profiles loaded onto it from the factory. It's got a profile for 223 Remington / 556 for an AR-15. It's got 308 Winchester with a sort of generic hunting bullet. It's got 22 long rifle, and it's got an air rifle. But obviously you're going to want to fine tune these profiles to make them suitable for your exact rifles. And you're also going to want to set your unit preferences and other preferences on the scope itself. And that can all be done through the Element Ballistics app. The app can be found on the Apple or Android App Store and is completely free. The app will ask you to give permission to use Bluetooth, location services, and internet connectivity. Grant these permissions. They are what allow you to connect with the scope and obtain weather reports for your location when not using the scope's onboard sensors. The app is an absolute powerhouse when it comes to calculating accurate firing solutions, but we're not going to jump into detail about the app right now. The main thing you need to know when setting up the scope is how to pair it and how to do a firmware update if new firmware is available. When the app is open and your scope switched on, you should see the HYPR-7 appear on the main screen of your app. When you click on this for the first time, it will send a pairing request to the scope. You can then look in your scope, and in your scope's display, you'll see a 6-digit number. This 6-digit number is generated by the app, and all you do is you enter that 6-digit number back into the app, and there you go, pairing is done. You won't have to do it again once this is done. The devices will remember each other. I should clarify that once you've actually created your ballistic profiles and set your unit preferences and sent this data over to the scope, you do not need to keep your phone with you to operate the scope. You can leave your phone behind when you go shooting. The scope operates entirely independently of the app. The app is only there to make the setup process a little bit easier. With your device paired, you'll see a configuration screen. If a firmware update is available, you should go ahead and do the update. We are constantly improving the way that everything works, so updated firmware is always a good thing. On the configuration screen, you'll see the screen timeout setting that we just discussed. You'll also see an option to decide where you want your inclination reading to come from. The scope has a built-in inclinometer. I would recommend just leaving it on the scope setting because the inclinometer on the HYPR-7 is actually very accurate. If, however, you do want to take an incline reading from an external Bluetooth rangefinder, for example, you can have it sent over with your range, and the scope will prioritize your Bluetooth device's incline reading over its own reading. I would suggest just leaving it on scope for now. You will also be able to choose your reticle type. The first option is a MIL or MOA hash type reticle. It will automatically set to MOA if you have your unit preference set to MOA, and MRAD if you have your unit preference set to MRAD. We'll discuss in the next video how to change unit preferences. Option 2 is a generic MIL dot reticle. Option 3 is a simple crosshair, which I think is actually awesome with the scope because it allows you to more clearly see where your predicted point of impact is. Option 4 is a live BDC reticle, which is basically a custom BDC reticle that the scope creates for you in real time based on your ballistic profile. Again, we'll get to that in a later video. And lastly, there's an option to draw your own reticle. Not something we're going to worry about right now. The last item in the configuration menu is an option to decide whether you want your predicted point of impact to show as a flashing dot that is overlaid over your reticle, or whether you want your entire reticle to shift to your predicted point of impact. I would say that you probably want to just play around with this and see what you prefer. With all of this done, you can hit disconnect, and there you go. That's your initial setup done and dusted. In the next video, we're going to look at the Element Ballistics app in more detail. We're going to show you how to set your unit preferences, and we're going to show you how to create your custom ballistic profiles and send them over to the scope so you can begin your zeroing process out in the field. Once again, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.